An Amish widow said, "My cabin only has one bed." The mountain man looked at her, bleeding from a railroad bullet, and whispered, "I don't mind." A storm raged outside, but inside something far more dangerous was brewing. A woman of God was forced to share her home, her space, her one bed with a total stranger. A stranger carrying secrets that could burn the whole valley to the ground. He wasn't just any mountain man. He was hunted by powerful men who had already cheated native families of their wages and now wanted blood. His blood. But this widow, Sophia, she carried a secret of her own. A stepdaughter the town scorned for her Arapaho blood. And when those railroad men rode in with fire and threats, this woman and this child stood on the ragged edge of losing everything they had. One cabin, one widow, one outlaw fighting for justice. This is the story of a family nobody expected, forged in the crucible of faith, fire, and unbelievable danger. When the snow finally clears, will they find mercy in each other's arms? Or will they be torn apart by the men who want them all dead? Drop a comment below and let me know which part of the world you're tuning in from today. And if you enjoy stories where the stakes are this high, make sure you subscribe, because you haven't heard anything yet. The Colorado wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It tore at the seams of Sophia Hawkstedler's small cabin, a lonely outpost against the fury of God's own breath. She pulled her shawl tighter, peering out the frost-rimmed window into a world of swirling white. The blizzard had come on fast, swallowing the foothills whole. Her woodpile, already worryingly small, was a half-buried mound in the growing drifts. The creek that usually gurgled a friendly tune now sounded like a frantic whisper in the dusk. The single room of her cabin felt impossibly large and suffocatingly small all at once. It was empty of the husband she'd lost, but full of his ghost. His chair still sat by the hearth, a silent sentinel. 2 long winters had passed since Jacob was laid in the frozen ground, but his presence lingered in the very grain of the wood. Sophia knelt, her plain dress rustling, and added another precious log to the fire. The flames licked at it slowly, casting dancing shadows across the simple room, the well-worn table, the single bed with its quilt of 1,000 memories, the small shelf holding her Bible, and then came the thud. It was heavy, a dead weight against her porch, almost lost in a blast of wind that rattled the door in its frame. Sophia froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Years on the frontier had taught her one thing above all else. Unexpected visitors, especially in a storm like this, rarely brought good news. "Lord, grant me wisdom," she whispered, her hand reaching for the oil lantern. Its warm glow was a small comfort, a tiny sun against the raging night. She moved toward the door. Another thud, weaker this time, followed by a groan so low it was almost part of the wind's song. With trembling fingers, Sophia drew back the heavy wooden bolt. She pulled the door open, fighting the wind's snarling resistance. Snow and ice crystals swirled into the room, a blast of bitter cold that made the lantern flame dance and spit. And there, sprawled on her porch, was a man. He was huge, larger than any man she'd ever seen up close. A giant felled by some unseen force. His buckskin jacket was dark and slick with blood on one shoulder. His face was half buried in the snow that was quickly trying to claim him. He stirred, a low moan escaping his lips, a puff of steam in the frigid air. "Mercy," Sophia breathed, setting the lantern down on the floor. She couldn't leave him. Her faith, the very bedrock of her life, wouldn't allow it. Every life was precious. Every soul was a child of God, no matter what trouble he was bringing to her door. Getting him inside was a battle. She was strong, her body hardened by years of homestead work, but he was dead weight. She grabbed him under his arms, her boots scraping on the icy porch, and pulled with everything she had. Inch by painful inch, she dragged him over the threshold, the storm clawing at them both. By the time she had him near the hearth, she was sweating, her simple cap damp against her hair despite the cold. She slammed the door shut, slid the bolt home, and finally turned to face her guest. His face was a road map of a hard life, carved by sun and wind. A strong jaw was covered in a rough beard, and a long faded scar ran from his temple into his hairline. Even unconscious, he looked fierce, dangerous, like a hibernating bear you wouldn't want to wake. "Sir?" she tried, touching his good shoulder. "Can you hear me?" His eyes flickered open. They were a startling, piercing blue, and for a second, they seemed to look right through her, into her very soul. Then they closed again. His lips moved, but the words were stolen by the wailing wind outside. Sophia worked fast. Her medical chest was always stocked. Yarrow to stop the bleeding, witch hazel to clean the wound, honey to fight the infection. These were the old ways, the ways of her people, passed down through generations. The bullet, thank the Lord, had only grazed him, but it had torn a nasty furrow through muscle and flesh. He drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked, muttering words she couldn't catch, his big frame twitching with pain. "I'm sorry," she said softly, not sure if he could hear her, her voice a strange counterpoint to the storm's fury. "My cabin only has one bed." His eyes opened again, brighter now, lit with the fire of a coming fever. His voice was a raw whisper, but the words were clear. "I don't mind." Then he was gone again, lost to the pain. Sophia finished binding his shoulder with clean linen. She covered him with every quilt she owned, piling them high. The storm beat against the cabin, rattling the shutters like a skeleton trying to get in. She added more wood to the fire, knowing how precious it was, but he needed the warmth. He needed to fight. As she worked, questions swirled in her mind. Who shot him? And a more terrifying thought. Would they come looking for him? Her isolated cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt fragile, exposed. The darkness outside the window was no longer empty. It felt like it was watching. The fever took hold as the night deepened. Sophia bathed his forehead with cool cloths, whispering prayers in English and the Pennsylvania Dutch of her childhood. He was so big he seemed indestructible, but she could feel the shadow of death hovering in the room, patient, waiting. Near midnight, as she sat reading her Bible by the flickering lamplight, his voice cut through the storm's noise. It was slurred but raw with anger. "Railroad men," he growled from his nest of quilts, "betrayed us all. The Arapaho workers, their blood money." Sophia's hands tightened on her Bible until her knuckles were white. Railroad disputes. That meant violence. It meant power and money and men who didn't care who they crushed. If this stranger had stood against them, his enemies were the most dangerous kind. She looked at him. This man Providence had dropped on her doorstep. His face was troubled even in his fevered sleep, as if he were still fighting battles in his dreams. The wind moaned and the snow kept falling, building a wall of white between her and the rest of the world. Her duty was clear. She would tend to him. She would trust in the Lord's protection. But she found herself glancing at the door again and again, checking the bolt, listening for any sound that wasn't the wind. The fever broke just before dawn. His breathing evened out, and his skin, when she touched his forehead, was cooler. Exhausted, Sophia finally let herself rest in Jacob's old chair, pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders. The fire had burned low, but she was too tired to move. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the storm, she studied his face again. In the calm of his sleep, the fierceness was gone, replaced by a deep, aching loneliness. It was a look she recognized. She saw it in her own reflection every single day. The storm hadn't lessened. The world outside was a churning sea of white. She knew then they would be trapped here for days. Just the two of them. The thought should have terrified her, but it didn't. Instead, she felt a strange, unsettling sense of purpose, as if God had sent her this trial for a reason she couldn't yet see. Her people believed in signs, in the subtle hand of God moving through the chaos of the world. "Dear Father," she prayed, her words a mere whisper, "grant me strength for whatever this path holds." She glanced at the sleeping stranger, at the blood on the bandages, at the trouble he represented. "And please," she added, her voice catching, "let me have chosen right." The cabin grew lighter, but the storm's gray pall made time feel strange and fluid. Sophia moved with the quiet efficiency of long practice, banking the fire, preparing a simple porridge, checking his bandages. The familiar routine was an anchor in a sea of uncertainty, but the questions still churned. Who was he? What had he done? And what dangers would follow him to her door when the snow stopped falling? The wind rattled the shutters, a sharp, angry sound, as if answering her unspoken fear. Sophia straightened her shoulders. She was an Amish widow. She was alone, but she was not helpless. She had her faith, her wits, and the quiet strength forged in hardship. Whatever trouble this man brought, she would face it. The storm had locked them in together. For now, she would do what needed to be done. One step at a time. One day at a time. Trusting in a plan she could not see. That was the Amish way, even when the path ahead was completely hidden in shadow. The new day brought no relief. The storm howled on, a relentless assault. Sophia dozed in the chair, waking at every sound from the man on the floor. Before the sun was even a suggestion in the eastern sky, she was up, stoking the fire, wrapping her heavy shawl tight against the bone-deep chill that had seeped into the cabin. She pulled on her boots and her warmest coat. The animals wouldn't wait for the weather to break. The walk to the barn was a brutal fight. Snow had drifted waist-high, and the wind was a physical force, shoving and clawing at her, its icy teeth biting through her clothes. Inside the barn, her milk cow, Sarah, lowed a greeting, her breath a plume of steam in the frigid air. The familiar chores were a comfort, measuring feed, pitching fresh hay, the rhythmic hiss of milk streaming into the pail. It was real. It was solid. When she returned to the cabin, her cheeks raw and red from the cold, she found him awake. His blue eyes were clearer now, the fever haze gone. But confusion clouded his face as he took in the plain wooden walls, the simple furnishings, the absence of any decoration. "Where am I?" His voice was a rough rasp. Sophia set the milk pail down and shrugged out of her snow-covered coat. "Thee is safe," she said, her voice calm and even, using the plain speech of her people. "I found thee on my porch last night. The storm was coming in." He tried to push himself up, his face contorting in a grimace of pain, before he fell back against the quilts. "Your porch?" His eyes scanned the room again. "This is an Amish home." "Yes," Sophia confirmed, moving to check his bandages. The blood hadn't soaked through. That was a good sign. "I am Sophia Hawkstedler. Now lie still. The wound is clean, but thee needs rest." "Asher," he muttered, his eyes closing for a moment. "Asher Boone." He tried to sit up again, his jaw set with stubbornness. "Much obliged for your help, Mrs. Hawkstedler, but I should be on my way." Sophia shook her head, her expression firm. "In this storm, thee wouldn't make it 100 yards. The Lord brought thee to my door, Mr. Boone, and here thee will stay until thee is strong enough to travel." He seemed to argue with himself for a moment, then sagged back into the quilts, defeated by his own weakness. Sophia busied herself preparing a simple breakfast. Fresh bread, still warm from yesterday's baking. Fresh, frothy milk in 2 cups. She set his portion on a small stool near the hearth and fixed him with a steady gaze. "I expect honesty, Mr. Boone. Who shot thee? And why?" He struggled up onto one elbow, his face tight with pain, and took a piece of bread. He chewed slowly, gathering his thoughts. "Railroad men," he said finally, his voice low and hard. "I caught their foreman, a man named Silas Kane, cheating the Arapaho workers." Sophia's hands stilled. "Cheating them how?" "They hired them to lay track for the new line, promised fair pay, then Kane started docking their earnings for infractions. A broken tool, a slow day, made up nonsense. Some days he'd pay them nothing at all, said their work wasn't up to snuff." "And thee spoke against this?" Sophia asked, her heart beginning to sink. Asher gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "More than spoke." A shadow crossed his face. "I found him burning the real work records. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. Things got heated. Now he and his men are hunting me. They're telling everyone I stole company funds." This was worse than she had imagined. This wasn't a simple brawl. The railroad was a giant, an unstoppable force, and this man had stood in its path. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. A young girl stood in the doorway, her arms piled high with kindling, a dusting of snow on her dark hair. She froze at the sight of the stranger by the fire, her eyes going wide with a mixture of fear and shock. "Come in, child, quickly!" Sophia called, moving to help her with the heavy door. This is Mr. Boone. He was injured in the storm and needed shelter. The girl Miriam set her wood down by the hearth, her movements precise and wary. She didn't look at Asher, but Sophia could feel her studying him from the corner of her eye. At 12 years old, Miriam had already learned to be cautious of a world that judged her on sight. Her Amish father had married her Arapaho mother, an act of love that had defied both of their communities. They were both gone now, taken by a fever years ago, but Miriam still carried the weight of their choice. She walked a tightrope between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. This is my stepdaughter Miriam, Sophia explained to Asher. She saw his gaze sharpen as he looked at the girl, truly looked at her. He saw the proud set of her cheekbones, the straight black hair, the dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He saw the story written on her face. Pleased to meet you, Miss Miriam, Asher said, his gruff voice softening in a way that surprised Sophia. Miriam just nodded, her face unreadable. She turned and began helping Sophia with the morning meal, her silence a shield she had learned to use long ago. The day passed in a strange, quiet tension. The storm raged outside. Inside, the three of them moved in their own orbits. Sophia tended the house and Asher's wound. Miriam practiced her letters at the table. Asher watched them both, his blue eyes thoughtful. Sophia felt a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Asher's fight was a righteous one. Defending the Arapaho workers spoke to a deep part of her own sense of justice. Hadn't her Jacob done the same, choosing love over the rigid rules of their community? But the railroad didn't care about righteousness. They cared about profit and power, and they were not known for mercy. If they tracked Asher here, what would they do to an Amish widow and a half-Arapaho girl? As they ate their simple supper of bean soup, Sophia bowed her head for their evening prayer. Dear Lord, she whispered, acutely aware of the two silent figures beside her. Guide our steps. Grant us wisdom and courage. Protect those who stand against injustice. And help us to be worthy. The wind slammed against the shutters, a violent punctuation to her prayer. She looked up. Asher was watching her, his expression unreadable. Miriam was methodically clearing the table, her face a careful mask. The lamplight cast a warm glow, creating an illusion of peace, of family. But it was a fragile peace, the eye of the storm. For now they were safe, but Sophia knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the real storm hadn't even started yet. The men hunting Asher Boone weren't going to give up, and they were getting closer with every passing hour. The morning light was pale and thin, filtered through the frosted glass of the window. The world outside was a silent, white wilderness. The storm had finally passed, leaving a deep and treacherous blanket of snow. Inside, the cabin was warm. Sophia knelt beside Asher, unwrapping his bandage. The wound was clean, beginning to heal. Hold still, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Asher grimaced as she cleaned the furrow in his shoulder. I should be up, he grumbled, trying to push himself up. Can't lie here like a felled tree while you two do all the work. Thee will do exactly that, Sophia replied, pressing him back down with a firm hand. Moving too soon will only tear it open again. From a nearby stool, Miriam watched them, her knitting needles frozen in her lap. The morning light glinted off the steel. Asher caught her gaze and offered a small, tired smile. What was your name again, little miss? The storm was making such a racket yesterday. I don't think I caught it proper. Miriam glanced at Sophia, seeking permission. Sophia nodded. Miriam, she said, her voice a soft whisper. Miriam Hochstedler. That's a fine, strong name, Asher said, wincing as Sophia applied a fresh poultice. Sophia's hands paused. She looked at her stepdaughter, then back at the man on the floor. An idea, a risk was forming in her mind. Miriam carries more history than just her name, Mr. Boone, she said, her voice quiet but clear. My late husband, Jacob, his first wife, Miriam's mother, was Arapaho. Understanding dawned in Asher's eyes. He looked at Miriam again, and this time he truly saw her. He saw the legacy in her features, the quiet pride that she tried so hard to hide. Miriam ducked her head, a familiar gesture of shame, bracing for the judgment that always came. The community, Sophia continued, her hands resuming their work, wrapping a clean linen strip around his shoulder. They whisper. They say Jacob betrayed our ways. Even now, years after her parents are gone, Miriam bears the weight of it. Asher's voice was gentle, but it cut through the quiet of the cabin. Look at me, Miriam. Hesitantly, the girl lifted her eyes. There is nothing to be ashamed of, he said, his gaze steady and kind. Your blood carries the strength of two proud peoples, the steadfast faith of the Amish and the ancient wisdom of the Arapaho. Don't ever let anyone tell you that's not something to hold your head high about. A faint blush colored Miriam's cheeks, and for the first time since he'd arrived, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. Her fingers found her knitting again, and the needles began to click with a new, confident rhythm. But the moment of connection was shattered by what Sophia said next. As they ate their midday meal, she looked Asher straight in the eye. There's something else thee should know, she said, her voice dropping lower. The elders. They have shunned me. Asher's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Shunned you? For raising Miriam? Sophia nodded, her gaze fixed on her bowl. They said I was embracing wickedness by keeping her, that I should send her to her mother's people, to live on the reservation. Her voice grew fierce, a fire smoldering beneath the calm surface. But I promised Jacob. On his deathbed, I promised him I would care for her as my own. She is my daughter, in all the ways that matter. That's a heavy burden, Asher said quietly, to be cast out by your own. The Lord guides my path, Sophia replied, though a slight tremor in her voice betrayed the cost of her conviction. Even when others cannot see it. Miriam reached across the table, and her small hand covered Sophia's. A silent, powerful thank you. Later, as dusk began to settle, Asher's gaze fell on the woodpile, visible through the window. That stack is getting dangerously low, he observed. I manage, or Sophia said. Once I'm on my feet, I'll chop enough to last you through the winter, he promised. Thee is kind to offer, Sophia said, a worried frown creasing her brow. But that won't be for some time yet. I won't have thee tearing that wound open again. But Sophia knew the wood wasn't the real problem. The real problem was time. How long could they stay hidden? How long before Silas Kane and his men started searching the outlying homesteads? That evening, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Sophia mended a tear in Miriam's dress. Asher, propped up in the chair, rested, and Miriam, her shyness slowly melting away, crept closer to him. Her eyes were fixed on the handle of the knife sheathed at his belt. It was beautifully carved. Did you make that? She asked, her voice barely audible. Asher smiled and carefully drew the knife from its leather sheath. No, this was a gift, from an old Arapaho friend. He held it out so she could see the intricate markings etched into the bone handle. See these? Each one tells a part of a story. Miriam leaned in, her face alive with fascination as Asher began to explain the symbols. The eagle for courage, the bear for strength, the winding river for a long journey. Sophia watched them from her chair, her needle moving in a steady rhythm, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Asher wasn't just a wanderer, a fighter. He understood. He saw Miriam not as a problem or a half-breed, but as a whole person, a bridge between two worlds. But as he spoke about his Arapaho friend, a new cold fear began to creep into Sophia's heart. He wasn't just defending strangers. He had a connection to them, a personal one. This trouble he was in, it was deeper than a simple dispute over wages, much deeper, and she and Miriam were now standing right in the middle of it. The fragile piece of the cabin felt like a sheet of thin ice, and she could hear it cracking beneath their feet. The days fell into a rhythm. It was a strange domestic truce, a pause in the storm of their lives. Each morning, Sophia would go to the barn, the crunch of her boots on the fresh snow the only sound in the vast, white silence. The familiar warmth of the animals, the sweet smell of hay, the steady hiss of milk into the pail. It was an anchor to the life she knew. Miriam, too, had her chores. She moved among the chickens with a quiet grace, her dark hair a stark contrast to the snow. She was blossoming under Asher's attention, the constant fear and shame she carried slowly receding, replaced by a tentative confidence. Asher, meanwhile, was a terrible patient. He chafed at the enforced rest, his energy a restless tide in the small cabin. One morning, Sophia was hanging laundry on the line, the frozen linen stiff in her hands when she heard it, the sharp, solid thwack of an axe biting into wood. She rounded the corner of the cabin, her heart leaping into her throat. There he was, shirt off, despite the cold, his back muscles cording with effort as he swung the axe. A small pile of split logs already lay at his feet. The bandage on his shoulder was stained bright red. "What does thee think thee is doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with alarm and frustration. He leaned on the axe handle, breathing heavily, a sheen of sweat on his skin. "Ma'am, a man can't just lie about while ladies do all the work. That woodpile wasn't going to chop itself." He tried to straighten up, to hide the wince of pain, but he couldn't fool her. "And now thy wound is bleeding again," she said, pointing at the stain. "Get inside, now." For a second, his stubborn pride flared in his blue eyes. But then he saw the look on her face. Not anger, but genuine fear. And he relented. He followed her into the cabin like a chastened schoolboy. "Stubborn man," she muttered as she unwrapped the bandage. The wound was angry and weeping. "The Lord gave us sense enough to heal." "Never was good at sitting still," he admitted, his voice low. "Pride is a sin, Mr. Boone," she said, her touch gentle as she cleaned the wound. "And a dangerous one at that." That evening, as if to make up for his foolishness, Asher started telling stories. He spoke of the high Rockies, of tracking elk through hidden valleys, of nights spent under a blanket of stars so thick you could almost touch them. Miriam sat at his feet, her chin in her hands, her eyes wide with wonder. The cabin filled with the magic of his words. Then Miriam, with the directness of a child, asked the question that had been hanging in the air. "The men you were helping, the Arapaho, what will happen to them now?" Asher's face grew grim, the firelight carving deep shadows into his features. "Cain will make them pay for what I did. He'll either run them off or starve them out. They were good men, honest men, and he treated them like animals." His hand went to his healing shoulder. "I didn't start that fight, Cain did. He threw the first punch when I showed him my ledger proving his theft. I just finished it. Left him with a broken jaw and a warning to pay the men what they were owed." He shook his head. "I reckon he's not the kind of man who takes a warning." Sophia's mending lay forgotten in her lap. A broken jaw. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a brawl, a violent confrontation. Silas Cain wouldn't just be angry. He'd be vengeful. He'd want more than just company funds back. He'd want payback. The next afternoon, Sophia went to the creek for water. It was a daily chore, a path she had walked 1,000 times. But today, something was different. Near the edge of the woods, half hidden by a snow-laden pine bough, she saw them. Hoof prints. Not her horses, not from a neighbor's mule. These were from shod horses, at least 3 of them. They hadn't come down the main path. They had been moving through the trees, staying out of sight. They had been scouting. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed her buckets and hurried back to the cabin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They weren't just coming. They were already here, watching, waiting. She burst into the cabin, her face pale. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Riders, in the woods by the creek." Asher was on his feet in an instant, his weakness forgotten. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously from the side. "How many?" "At least 3, she whispered. His face was grim. "That'll be Cain's men. They're trying to find my trail." He looked at Sophia, then at Miriam, who had frozen by the hearth, her face a mask of terror. A look of profound regret crossed his face. "I've brought this trouble to your door. I should leave. Draw them off." "And go where?" Sophia shot back, her fear turning to a fierce, protective anger. "Thee is still wounded. They would track thee down in hours." "No, thee is staying here." "Sophia." "This is my home," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all. "And Miriam's home. We do not run." She looked at the door, at the heavy wooden bolt. It suddenly seemed like a flimsy defense. "But we must be clever," she added, her mind racing. "They think they are hunting one man. They do not know he has allies." Asher looked at her, a newfound respect in his eyes. He saw not just a gentle Amish widow, but a woman of steel, forged in the fires of loss and hardship. The sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of blood and orange. The long shadows of the trees stretched toward the cabin like grasping fingers. The woods were no longer a place of beauty, they were a place of menace. The watchers were still out there. They knew it. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every sigh of the wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. The night was coming, and with it, Silas Kane and his men. The fragile peace was shattered. The fight for their lives had just begun. The night was a torment. No one slept. Every gust of wind sounded like riders. Every shadow seemed to hold a man with a gun. Asher sat in Jacob's chair by the cold hearth, a heavy piece of firewood clutched in his hand, his eyes fixed on the door. Sophia sat at the table, her Bible open but her eyes unseeing. Miriam was a small, trembling bundle under a quilt on the floor, but the attack didn't come. Morning arrived, cold and gray. The tension in the cabin was so thick you could taste it. They were living on a knife's edge. "They're playing with us," Asher said, his voice a low growl. "They know I'm hurt. They think they have us trapped. They'll wait until they're sure we're desperate." "Then we will not be desperate," Sophia said, her voice steady. She stood and began the morning routine as if it were any other day. She would not show fear. She would not give them that satisfaction. Later that morning, a new sound broke the silence. Not the thud of hoofbeats, but the slow, rhythmic squeak of a wagon. A single rider was with it. Sophia peered through a crack in the shutters. Her heart sank. It was Elder Schmidt, the head of their church community, the man who had led the charge to have her shunned. He never visited. Never. "He can't see you," she hissed to Asher. "Get down, out of sight." Asher slid to the floor, pulling a quilt over himself, his face grim. Sophia took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and opened the door. "Elder Schmidt," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "To what do I owe this surprise?" The elder was a thin, severe-looking man with eyes like chips of ice. He did not smile. "Sophia, the Lord has laid a concern upon my heart, a widow alone, after such a storm." His eyes swept past her, probing the shadows of the cabin. "You are well?" "We are well, thank you," Sophia said, deliberately blocking his view. "Miriam and I are quite capable." Of course," he said, but his eyes were still searching. "There are troubling rumors in town, talk of railroad trouble. An outlaw, they say, a violent man, seen heading into these hills." His gaze was sharp, accusatory. "You have seen nothing unusual?" The lie felt like a stone in her throat, but she met his gaze without flinching. "Only the snow, Elder. The Lord has blessed us with a great deal of snow." He stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. She could feel him weighing her words, searching for a crack in her composure. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Very well. Remember, Sophia, the community may have cast you out, but we are still your people. Harboring an outsider, a man of violence, that would be a sin beyond redemption." He didn't need to say more. The threat was clear. He turned and left without another word. Sophia closed the door, her hands trembling. Asher emerged from under the quilt, his face a thundercloud. "Schmidt!" He spat the name like a curse. "I should have known." "You know him?" Sophia asked, bewildered. "I don't know him," Asher said, his voice tight with a dawning realization. "But your husband did. Jacob." Sophia stared at him. "Jacob? What are you not telling me?" Asher finally met her eyes and the truth came tumbling out. "I wasn't just passing through, Sophia. I came here looking for you. For this cabin." He took a breath. "I knew your husband. We weren't friends, not exactly. But we had a common cause. He was also investigating the railroad. He knew they were cheating the Arapaho. He was gathering proof." The world seemed to tilt under Sophia's feet. "What? No. He was a farmer, a carpenter. He was more than that," Asher said gently. "He was a brave man. He told me he was close to finding something. A ledger, a record book, that would expose not just Cain, but the men above him. And he told me something else." Asher's eyes bored into hers. "He told me there was an elder in his own community that he didn't trust. A man he suspected was taking railroad money to keep the Amish folk from making a fuss about the new track cutting through their land. A man named Schmidt. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Schmidt's visit wasn't a coincidence. The hoof prints. They weren't Kane's men. They were Schmidt's. He had been checking to see if the outlaw had made it here. And his warning wasn't a warning at all. It was an interrogation. Sophia, Asher asked, his voice low and urgent, tell me exactly how Jacob died. It was an accident, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. A logging accident. A tree fell the wrong way. Where? Asher pressed. Where did it happen? In the North Woods, she said, her mind reeling. Near. She stopped, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Near the new railroad survey line. A terrible silence filled the cabin. The logging accident. Elder Schmidt's sudden concern. Jacob's secret investigation. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a pattern, a conspiracy. Her husband hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered. And the man who had orchestrated it had just been standing on her porch. He hadn't come to warn her. He had come to see if the last loose end of his betrayal, the man Jacob was supposed to meet, was now trapped in her cabin. He hadn't come to help. He had come to confirm the location for the killers. The quiet, orderly world Sophia Hochstetler had known was a lie. Her husband was a murdered hero. Her elder was a traitor. And the men hunting Asher weren't just coming for him. They were coming to silence the last echo of Jacob's fight for justice. They were coming to finish the job. Sophia staggered back, leaning against the table for support. The truth was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Jacob. Murdered. The word echoed in the silent cabin, a blasphemy against the peaceful life she thought they had lived. Miriam, who had been hiding in the small sleeping loft, crept down the ladder, her face pale. She had heard everything. He told me to guard the hearth, she whispered, her voice trembling. Sophia and Asher turned to look at her. What did you say, child? Sophia asked gently. Papa, Miriam said, her eyes fixed on the large stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The day he left, the last day I saw him, he told me it was the heart of the house. He said, whatever happens, Miriam, you guard the hearth. It had seemed like a father's poetic words to his daughter, a sentimental farewell. But now it sounded like something else entirely, an instruction, a clue. Asher was already moving, his injuries forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. He knelt before the massive stone hearth, running his hands over the rough-hewn rocks. Sophia and Miriam joined him, their eyes scanning the mortar, the stones Jacob himself had set years ago. Here, Asher breathed, his fingers tracing the edge of a large, flat stone near the base. The mortar around it was slightly different, a shade lighter than the rest. He pressed on it. Nothing. He tried to pry at the edge with his fingers. It was solid. The poker, Sophia said, her mind sharp and clear. She fetched the heavy iron fireplace poker. Asher wedged the tip into the tiny crack and leaned his weight on it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of scraping stone, the rock moved. It shifted inward, revealing not a compartment, but the dark, earthy space behind the wall. Miriam held the lantern closer. The flickering light fell on a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle tucked deep inside the cavity. With trembling hands, Sophia reached in and pulled it out. It was Jacob's. She recognized the careful way he tied his knots. She unwrapped the oilskin with a sense of dread and reverence. Inside was not a ledger. It was a journal, a small, leather-bound book filled with Jacob's neat, careful script. She opened it. The pages were a chronicle of his last months, his growing suspicion of the railroad's dealings, his secret meetings with Arapaho leaders, his meticulous notes on Silas Kane's cheating, cross-referenced with his own observations. It was all there, a detailed account of the crime. And then she saw the name. Elder Schmidt. Jacob had followed him. He had documented Schmidt's secret meetings with Kane, the parcels of money changing hands. He had uncovered the entire rot at the heart of his own community. The final entry was dated the morning of his death. Schmidt knows I'm watching. I saw it in his eyes today. Kane is getting nervous. I am to meet a man named Boone in the foothills in 3 days, a friend of the Arapaho. He has his own proof. Together we can take this to the marshal. I must go to the North Woods first. S is meeting me there. He says he has something for me. I pray it is not a trap. A trap. It had been a trap. Schmidt had lured him to his death. And Asher. Asher was the man he was supposed to meet. He had walked right into the middle of it all. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Sophia's cheek. It was proof. Hard, undeniable proof of murder and betrayal. Jacob's final testament, his justice delivered into her hands. And at that exact moment from the woods outside came the unmistakable sound of approaching riders. It wasn't 2 or 3 this time. It was more. Many more. They weren't scouting anymore. They weren't waiting. Elder Schmidt had given them the signal. The trap was closing. Asher grabbed the heavy axe he'd used on the woodpile. Sophia clutched the journal to her chest. Miriam stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror. The riders burst from the tree line, dark figures against the white snow. At the lead was a man with a brutal, scarred face, Silas Kane, and riding beside him, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, was Elder Schmidt. They surrounded the cabin. There was no escape. "Sophia!" Schmidt's voice was a harsh command, stripped of all its pious pretense. "Send out the outlaw Asher Boone. Do so, and you and the child will be spared." Asher moved to the door, his knuckles white on the axe handle. "Don't listen to him, Sophia. He's a liar and a murderer." "We know what you did!" Sophia screamed through the door, her voice raw with grief and rage. "We know you killed my husband." A moment of silence outside. Then Kane's cruel laugh cut through the air. "Your husband was a fool who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Just like his friend Boone here. Now I'm done talking. You have 1 minute to send him out, or we burn this cabin to the ground with all of you inside." Sophia looked at the journal in her hands. Jacob's last words, his courage, his sacrifice. Then she looked at Miriam, her face streaked with tears but her eyes defiant. She looked at Asher, wounded but ready to fight to the death. She would not let Jacob's death be for nothing. "They think this is the end," she whispered, a fire kindling in her eyes that had nothing to do with Kane's threats. "But they have forgotten one thing." Asher looked at her, puzzled. "What's that?" "This is an Amish cabin," she said, a strange, fierce smile on her face. "And we are prepared for long winters." She strode to the back of the cabin to a large, unassuming wooden chest that sat against the wall. She threw open the lid. It wasn't filled with quilts or winter clothes. It was filled with rifles, and boxes upon boxes of ammunition. Jacob hadn't just been a farmer. He had been a man prepared for the wickedness of the world, and his widow was about to pick up his fight. "Miriam," Sophia said, her voice ringing with command. "Bar the windows. Asher, take the front. They want a fire? We'll give them one." The sight of the rifles stunned Asher into silence for a beat. This woman was a bottomless well of surprises. A quiet Amish widow one moment, a righteous warrior the next. A grin split his face. "Yes, ma'am." He took one of the rifles, checking the action with an expert's familiarity. It was a Henry repeater, well-oiled and ready. He handed another to Sophia. Her hands were steady as she took it, her movements sure. She had clearly handled one before. "Miriam," Sophia called, never taking her eyes off the front window. "The trap door to the root cellar. Go. Now. And do not come out, no matter what you hear." "No!" the girl cried, her fear replaced by a stubborn fire that mirrored Sophia's. "I can load. Papa taught me." She grabbed a box of cartridges, her small hands surprisingly nimble as she opened it. Sophia hesitated for only a second. She saw the same steel in her daughter's eyes that she felt in her own heart. She gave a curt nod. "Stay low." Outside, Kane was getting impatient. "Time's up," he roared. A torch arced through the air, landing on the roof of the small porch with a soft whoomp. Flames began to lick at the dry timbers. "They're trying to smoke us out," Asher said, peering through a crack in the shutter. "There are 8 of them, and Schmidt." "The Lord will deliver the wicked into our hands," Sophia said, her voice a low, steady prayer. She rested the barrel of the rifle in a notch in the wall she and Jacob had built for just this purpose, for defense against wolves. She never imagined the wolves would walk on 2 legs. "Wait for my shot," Asher said. He lined up his sights on one of the men who was dismounting with a can of oil. "Let's thin the herd." The cabin exploded with the roar of the rifle. The man with the oil can spun around and dropped, a dark stain spreading on the snow beneath him. Chaos erupted outside. The riders scattered for cover, firing wildly at the cabin. Bullets splintered the wooden walls, punching holes of daylight into the dim interior. Sophia took a deep breath, sighted on a man reloading behind a wagon, and squeezed the trigger. Her shot was true. The man cried out and clutched his shoulder, staggering back. "Two down," Asher grunted, working the lever on his rifle. He fired again. Another rider's horse screamed and fell, trapping its rider's leg. Kane and Schmidt were bellowing orders, trying to regain control. The fire on the porch was growing, smoke beginning to seep into the cabin. The air grew thick and acrid. Miriam coughed but kept her station, laying out fresh cartridges for them. "We can't stay in here," Asher yelled over the din. "The smoke will get us before the bullets do. We need to get to the barn." "The back window," Sophia said, already moving. "It leads to the woodpile. It'll give us some cover." Asher laid down a volley of covering fire while Sophia unbarred the rear window. Cold, clean air rushed in, a blessed relief. "Go!" Asher shouted. "I'm right behind you." Sophia pushed Miriam through the window first. The girl scrambled over the sill and dropped into the snowdrift behind the cabin. Sophia followed, her rifle clutched tight. She landed hard, the impact jarring her, but she was up in a second, pulling Miriam toward the relative safety of the massive woodpile. Asher came last, diving through the window just as a volley of bullets ripped through the space where he'd been standing. He landed, rolled, and came up firing. They were exposed. The 100-foot dash to the barn was a death trap. Kane's men were already repositioning, circling the cabin to cut them off. "They're pinning us down!" Asher yelled, reloading. "We're not going to make it." The fire on the cabin was roaring now, flames climbing the walls, casting a hellish orange glow on the snow. Their home, their sanctuary, was being consumed. Just as a wave of despair washed over Sophia, a new sound cut through the chaos. It wasn't gunfire. It was a yell, a war cry. From the woods on the far side of the clearing, figures erupted from the trees. They were on foot, moving with impossible speed and silence across the snow. They were armed with bows and rifles, Arapaho warriors. Asher stared, his jaw dropping. "It's Black Eagle," he breathed in disbelief. "The men from the railroad camp. But how?" The warriors fell upon Kane's men from the flank with a righteous fury. Arrows flew with deadly accuracy. Gunshots echoed from the trees. Kane's men, caught completely by surprise, were thrown into a panic. Their organized assault dissolved into a desperate fight for survival. Sophia saw her chance. "Now!" she screamed. She, Asher, and Miriam broke from the cover of the woodpile and sprinted for the barn. Bullets zipped past them, kicking up puffs of snow. A searing pain shot through Sophia's arm, and she stumbled. But Asher grabbed her, half dragging her the last few feet. They tumbled through the barn doors just as Black Eagle's men overwhelmed the last of the railroad thugs. Inside the cavernous, hay-scented darkness of the barn, they collapsed, gasping for breath. Sophia looked down at her arm. A bullet had torn through the flesh of her forearm. It was bleeding freely, but the bone was intact. The sounds of the fight outside died down, replaced by shouts in the Arapaho language. The cabin was now a raging inferno, the roof caving in with a deafening roar. Everything was gone. Everything except the journal, which was still tucked securely inside Sophia's dress. Asher helped her bind the wound with a strip of cloth torn from her apron. Black Eagle. How did he know? As if in answer, the barn doors creaked open. The tall, proud figure of an Arapaho warrior stood silhouetted against the burning cabin. It was Black Eagle himself. He looked at Asher, then his gaze fell on Miriam. His face, which had been hard and grim, softened. He spoke not to Asher, but to the young girl. His voice was deep and resonant, and he spoke in the Arapaho tongue. Miriam, who had only ever known a few words from her mother, seemed to understand him instinctually. Then he looked at Sophia and switched to heavily accented English. "The girl's father, Jacob. He was a true friend. He sent word to us many weeks ago. He said if we ever saw smoke rising from his cabin when the snow was deep, it meant trouble." He said we were to come. For his daughter. Jacob. Even from the grave, her husband was still protecting them. He had known this day might come. He had forged an alliance, a final contingency plan with the very people he was trying to help. The fight was over, but the battle was far from won. Silas Kane and Elder Schmidt were nowhere to be seen. They had escaped in the chaos, and they knew about the journal. Asher looked at Sophia, his face grim in the flickering firelight. "They'll be back," he said, "and they'll bring more men. They can't let that journal get to the authorities." Black Eagle nodded in agreement. "They will ride for the fort to get the army. They will tell them we are savages who attacked innocent men." They were trapped. The cabin was gone. Sophia was wounded. And two powerful, ruthless men were now mobilizing all their resources to hunt them down and bury the truth forever. They had won the skirmish, but the war was just beginning. They had nowhere to run, and the full weight of the railroad's power was about to come crashing down on them. The ashes of the cabin were still smoldering as dawn broke, casting a pall of gray smoke over the snow-covered valley. The scene was one of devastation. The bodies of Cain's men lay where they had fallen, stark and still in the cold morning light. Black Eagle's warriors moved with quiet purpose, gathering weapons and tending to their own wounded. Inside the barn, Sophia sat on a hay bale, while Asher tightened the bandage on her arm. The pain was a dull, throbbing ache, but her mind was sharp. "They will go to Fort Collins," she said, her voice flat. "Cain will tell the commander that his men were attacked by Arapaho raiders, led by an outlaw. He'll have Schmidt with him to act as a respectable witness." Asher nodded grimly. "And the army will believe him. They'll send out a cavalry patrol with orders to shoot on sight. We'll be fugitives." Black Eagle, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke. "We cannot stay here. My people will move back into the high country. You can come with us. You will be safe there." It was a generous offer, a path to survival, but Sophia shook her head. "No, running is not an answer. We run, and they win. Cain keeps his power, Schmidt keeps his secrets, and Jacob's death means nothing." She clutched the journal through the fabric of her dress. "This has to see the light of day. It has to be heard by someone who will listen." "And who would that be?" Asher asked, his voice laced with cynicism. "The law in this territory is bought and paid for by the railroad." "Not all of it," Sophia said, a determined glint in her eye. "U.S. Marshal Elias Thorne. He came through here last year. He's a federal lawman. He doesn't answer to the railroad or the local army post. They say he's a hard man, but fair." "And where is this paragon of justice?" "His office is in Denver," Sophia said. Denver. It might as well have been on the moon. It was 100 miles of brutal, winter-bound territory away. A journey that would be difficult for a healthy man, let alone a wounded woman, a half-starved outlaw, and a 12-year-old girl. And they would be hunted every step of the way. "It's suicide," Asher said flatly. "No," Sophia countered, her gaze unwavering. "Staying here is suicide. Fleeing to the mountains is defeat. Going to Denver, it's a chance. A small one, perhaps, but it is a chance for justice." Miriam, who had been silent through it all, spoke up. "We should go," she said, her small voice clear and strong. "It's what Papa would have done." That settled it. Black Eagle saw the resolve in their faces. "The journey will be hard," he said. "You will need supplies, horses." He gave a sharp command in his own language. His men began to move, gathering supplies from the fallen railroad men and saddling the best of their horses. They brought them to the barn, 3 sturdy mounts, saddlebags filled with food, ammunition, and a medical kit. "These men tried to destroy your family," Black Eagle said, his hand resting for a moment on Miriam's shoulder. "Let what they brought for evil be used for good. Go east. Avoid the main trails. Follow the frozen rivers when you can. The ice will hide your tracks. May the Great Spirit guide you." With a final, solemn nod, he and his warriors melted back into the forest, leaving the 3 of them alone in the quiet, smoking ruins of their world. They mounted up. Asher took the lead, his rifle resting across his saddle. Miriam rode in the middle, a small, determined figure. Sophia brought up the rear, her wounded arm held tight against her body, the journal a heavy weight against her heart. They rode away from the devastation, not looking back. their faces set toward the distant promise of the snow-capped peaks that lay between them and Denver. The first 2 days were a blur of cold and exhaustion. They rode hard, pushing the horses, pushing themselves. They ate in the saddle, slept in short, fitful bursts in hidden, snow-covered thickets. The silence of the winter landscape was immense, broken only by the crunch of their horses' hooves and the whisper of the wind. On the third day, they saw it, a plume of smoke rising from a valley ahead. "A settlement?" Miriam asked, her voice hopeful. Asher shook his head, his eyes narrowed. "No, that's a patrol camp. Army." They had been found. Kane and Schmidt had moved faster than they'd anticipated. The net was closing around them. "We have to go around," Sophia said. "They'll have scouts out," Asher countered. "They'll cut our tracks eventually. We need to split them up. Create a diversion." His eyes scanned the terrain. They were on a high ridge overlooking a narrow, winding canyon. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. "I can lead them on a chase through that canyon," he said. "It's tight and full of switchbacks. I can keep them busy for hours. It'll give you and Miriam time to get clear." "No," Sophia said immediately. "We are not splitting up. That's a death sentence." "It's a better chance than we have now," he argued. "Sophia, you have to get that journal to Denver. That's all that matters now. I can handle a few soldiers." Before she could protest further, he leaned over from his saddle and gave her a hard, quick look. "Promise me," he said, his blue eyes intense. "Promise me you'll get it there." He didn't wait for an answer. He spurred his horse, letting out a wild yell, and galloped down the slope directly toward the army camp. It was a brave, foolish, magnificent act. The soldiers in the camp scrambled, caught off guard, shouted orders, bugle calls, and then the thunder of a dozen horses in pursuit. Asher led them away, down into the twisting labyrinth of the canyon. Sophia watched him go, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had a choice: flee, as he had asked, or turn back and fight. But then she looked at Miriam, at the precious cargo she carried, and she knew what she had to do. "Come," she said to Miriam, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We have to go." They turned their horses and rode hard, away from the sounds of the chase, away from the man who had just sacrificed himself for them. The fate of Asher Boone was unknown, but the fate of Jacob's journal now rested entirely on the shoulders of a wounded Amish widow and a 12-year-old girl, alone in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The most dangerous part of their journey had just begun.